My girlfriend's in the bedroom playing Animal Crossing, trying not to disturb me. Okay, 1 minute. We might as well just get started. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join me in this Intro to Animation lecture session. We're going to treat this like a normal lecture. So whenever you have a question about anything that I'm talking about, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll pause every once in a while to answer any questions you guys might have. So because this is a talk on animations and we're dealing with a video chat here, it might not be ideal to see how the animations are working through a video chat. So what I went ahead and did was any coding examples that we're going to be working on or that I'll be presenting to you guys, I created a CodePen link where you can see the example in real time as I'm coding it, in case you're dealing with any lag or anything on my end through the video. You can also interact with these animations real time in your browser to see, what the outcome is as we finish coding it. I would advise maybe keep the video on and don't focus too much on the CodePen unless you are experiencing a lot of lag and just want to see what the animation is like. Okay, so the materials that we're going to cover today. I could have selected tons of stuff to teach, but I picked a specific one that I think you guys will get the most use out of. And we're going to take a deep dive into the CSS transition property. Now, some of you that might already know about the CSS transition property, there's a lot more to know about it. So, even if you know it, you're going to learn a ton of new stuff today. We're going to do a shallow dive or just like a quick peek at animation performance and what to look out for when you are animating. And then we're going to do 3 examples. So we're going to live code 3 examples of ways that we could use the transition CSS property. And once we're done, I will go over some other ways that we could use to animate our elements in the browser. Now, there will be 3 live coding examples here. And as we know, live coding examples always go really well in these talks. So we'll see how that works out. So to start out, so the CSS transition property, what is it? What does it do? The CSS transition property is something that allows you to listen for changes on a specific CSS property. So it will listen for a change to happen on a CSS property. And if that change happens, it will actually animate from its current state to its updated state over a set period of time. Now, don't worry if me explaining over video doesn't make sense. We are going to take a look at some code. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share screen. Desktop 1. Okay, and just let me know, just give me a thumbs if you guys could see my screen. Awesome. Okay, so right now what we have here is just a box in our HTML that is green by default, and when we hover over that box, it turns to red. Now, if instead we wanted that green state to transition to that red state, we could go ahead and add the transition property on our box element. And the first value that the transition takes is the property type. So what do we want to listen to for changes? In this case, we want to listen to the background CSS property. And how long do we want that transition to take when we trigger that animation? So let's say we want to listen to the background property, and anytime that background value changes, we want to animate to the new value over a duration of 0.5 seconds. So if we hover over this box now, you'll see that it actually transitions to the red color rather than just popping in. Okay, so quickly, let's break down how this transition property works by taking a look at transition. Let's see how it works by breaking down the values that it takes. Okay, so the first value that the transition property takes is the property type. And the property type could be any CSS property. So we could be listening to the width, the height, the background, the border radius, any CSS property. There are 2 special keywords that you could use in this space, and one of them is all. And what that does, it allows you to listen to all of the properties on this CSS element. So if your width changed, if your height changed, if your background changed, it would actually transition all of those. Now, this is something that I don't recommend using, partially because you want to be explicit with what you're animating. You don't want to just do a catch-all and say, hey, here's an element, let's animate every single CSS property on this element. Because you don't know, somebody might come in here and add another property, or there's a property that's added through JavaScript that you might not want to animate. So I would say for the property value, avoid using all. Okay, so there's one more, and it's none. So you can set the property type to none. And what that does is it erases all of the transitions that are currently present on an element. So let's say, for instance, we had this transition. Oh, it's broken because of the semicolon. Let's say we had this transition where it's fading from green to red. And then something inside of our UI changed where we no longer want this transition to be present on our box anymore. What we could do in JavaScript is to set the transition to be none on this element, and that would erase all of the transitions that were set. So that would essentially erase any transition that we set inside of our CSS. So if you want to cancel out transitions, set the property type to none. Okay, so the first value is property type. The second value, which you add by creating a space, is the duration. So just like the word says, this is how long you want your transition to take place. So in this case, we have 0.5 seconds. So it's going to transition from its initial state to its updated state over a period of 0.5 seconds. Now, duration is something you can define in seconds. So you can do something like 1 second or 0.5 seconds, or you could define it in milliseconds. So we could say we want it to take 500 milliseconds. It's your choice, whatever you prefer. There is no benefit to using one or the other. The third value that is specified in the transition is the timing function. And what is a timing function? Good question. A timing function is something that establishes an acceleration curve on your transition. And what an acceleration curve is when your animation is happening, the speed of that animation can vary at certain points in your transition. So an example would be your animation could start off slow, build up speed, so start moving really quickly, and then slow down as it reaches the end value. Sometimes another term for this is that's used is easing. So there's two ways to specify a timing function. One way is these built-in keywords that CSS has. And we can take a look at these built-in keywords by going to MDN and taking a look at them. Now, don't worry about what link I'm on and what these easing functions are. I will show you an easy way to define your eases without having to memorize any of these keywords or the special easing function that we'll take a look at in a second. But what these built-in easing timing functions are, you can specify, you can say, I want the timing function to be linear. And what linear would do is, as it says here, it would say from beginning to end, a constant rate. So your animation would transition from its current state to its end state without any fluctuation in speed between the start and the end state. Then there's the built-in keywords like ease. And what ease would do is it says your animation would start slowly, accelerate sharply, and then slows gradually towards the end. So as you can see now, it's sort of building this thing where it's starting slow, going really fast, and then slowing down towards the end again. Now, we're not going to go over all of these, but there's a bunch of these built-in eases that you could use. Again, don't worry where these are, and to memorize them, we will show an easier way to do this. Okay, so that's one way to define this timing function. So if we wanted to use a linear timing function, we could just type linear as the third value to transition. And now if we hover over our element, well, this is a little bit hard to tell because it's background. So let's go ahead and use a property that's a little bit easier to see on transition. We're gonna go ahead and set a transform scale 1.5. And all this is gonna do is it's actually gonna scale our box to 150% of its original size on hover. And We don't want to be listening to changes on our background. We now want to be listening to changes on our transform CSS property. So if we hover over our box now, you'll see that our box grows in a linear timing function. So it's not speeding up, it's not slowing down. But if we use something like ease, where we read earlier that it starts slow, builds up speed, and slows down when it gets to the end, if we hover over it now, you'll see that it has a nice transition. It kind of eases in. It starts slow, builds up speed, and then eases into its final section. Okay, the second way to define a timing function, and this is a little bit tricky, is with something called a function value. And a function value is essentially what a function is in JavaScript. It's a function in CSS, which is a little weird, but the function name is Bezier curve. And that function takes in 4 arguments, and it's just 4 points. Now, we won't get into too much detail what this is doing, but I will show you guys what this Bezier curve actually does. So if we go back to MDN, you see that each of these timing functions has this curve here, right? So what a cubic Bezier curve is, or a Bezier curve, is something like this. Take a look at this red line. It is composed of a starting point, an ending point, and 2 Bezier handles. So those 4 arguments that you see inside of that function are the position of this point, the position of this point, and this point. Again, this is just so you understand what it is if you ever see it in the wild, but don't worry about ever building out one of these on your own. You will never, ever have to do that. So that's the second way to define a timing function. So what is that easy way that I talked about, where we don't have to memorize anything and we could pick an easing function easily without having to memorize stuff? Well, there's a site called easings.net, which is used by a lot of people. And what it gives you is a visual of all these timing functions. And when you hover over them, there's this little indicator on the right, that shows you how the animation will react. So if we look at this one, you'll see that it starts slow and it speeds up as it gets towards the end. So when you go to pick a timing function, I would just go to easings.net, pick one of these, click on them, and then here it will give you the cubic Bezier that is responsible for that type of curve. So let's go ahead and try this one in our code, which is here. So instead of ease, we're going to specify this cubic Bezier. And when we save and we hover over it, you see that it's like this drastic pop in, like it's almost like in your face. So once you've been doing animation for a while, what I would recommend is when you start playing around with the different types of eases, don't just go in and pick one, set it, and be like, oh, okay, this is good enough. Let's use this. Try a couple different ones, because depending on the type of ease, it'll give a certain character to your animation. Like this one, for instance, it's sort of like it's in your face. It's coming at you fast. So it's like this button or this UI element is demanding attention. There's other timing functions that you could use that are a lot more subtle, like this, where it'll slowly build in. And that's like a subtle effect. So let's say if the button had a timing function that was more subtle, it's not drawing your attention, it's just slowly easing into place, versus one that abruptly pops into place using one of these faster Bezier timing functions. So that is a second way to define a timing function. The last and fourth value that a transition takes is the delay. And just like it says, that's the delay. So that's how long you want your element to wait before the transition is triggered. So let's go ahead and set a delay of 0.5 seconds on our box. If we hover over it, you'll notice nothing happens for 0.5 seconds, and then the animation starts playing. You'll also notice that when we hover off of it, the value changes back to its default value, but it will wait 0.5 seconds before it animates back to its original value. So just like the duration, the delay can be set in seconds or milliseconds. And there is one strange thing you can do with delay. I'll let you guys know about it just so you know, but this is probably something you will never use. So you can actually set a negative value on delay. And what is that going to do? That's actually going to start your animation, not from the beginning, but from a further point in your animation. So if we do minus 0.25 seconds, it's going to skip the whole first 250 milliseconds of our animation and just continue from that point onward. So if we hover over now, you'll see that there's this weird pop in the beginning. And that's because we're missing the whole first 250 milliseconds of our transition. This is something I've never used in my 10 years of developing, but this is something I learned a couple days ago. If you guys ever see a negative delay, you're skipping the first part of your animation. Okay, couple other things to know about transition before we is if you do not set a delay, it defaults to 0, so there'll just be no delay. That makes sense. And if you do not specify a timing function, it will default to ease. And if you remember, ease is the one where it starts slowly, builds up speed, and finishes slowly when it reaches its endpoint. One other thing to know here is that if you do not specify an ease, and instead just specify some sort of second value, let's say 1 second here, this property is smart enough to know that 1 second is not a timing function. It will know that that's a delay. So you don't have to worry about saying, oh, I want like no timing function, and I want a delay of 1 second. You could simply just say, I wanted a duration of 0.5 seconds, and I want a delay of 1 second. It's smart enough to know that this is not a timing function. Instead, it's a delay. Okay, so next step. What if we want to transition multiple elements on our CSS property? So we're transitioning the transform CSS property. What if we also want to transition the background color? So on our hover, let's go ahead and change the background to red. So if we hover over this, we're not getting any animation. Okay, which is correct. Oh, okay. It's like, okay, so you see the red is popping in. So if we also want this red background color to transition, what we could do is we could separate our values using a comma. So you could specify multiple transitions by separating your values with a comma, or separating your group of values with a comma. So now let's specify, we also want to watch the background property so that anytime the value changes, we want it to transition over 500 milliseconds. So now when we hover over it, you'll see that it's scaling and the background color is also transitioning. So it's doing both. So there is no limit, or at least there is no limit that I know of, to how many different CSS properties you can watch and transition. So you can do 4 or 5 if you want, but if you're doing 5, there's probably some other issue. Okay, one last thing to know about the transition element is that you can specify a different ease. So let's get rid of the background first. So you can specify a different ease when you hover over and when you hover out. So we can, for instance, use this ease, or the default ease. So we know that if you don't set a timing function, it's using the ease timing function. So we can say, this is what we want to happen on hover. But when you're not hovering, we want to use linear as the timing function. So now if we hover over it, when we hover onto the element, it uses that ease timing function. When we hover off of it, you see that it uses the linear timing function. So this is the transition that it's using when you hover onto the element. This is the transition that it's using when you are not hovering over the element. So again, one ease when you hover over, different ease when you hover off. This is a good method to use if, let's say you want to draw attention to the button when somebody hovers over it, but when they're done with it and they want to move on and do something else, you can make it fade subtly into the background so that you're not drawing more attention to the button. So that is all of the ways that you could use transition. Next, we're going to jump into 3 examples of how we could actually use transition to code cool CSS animations. Does anybody have any questions on what we covered so far? No questions? Anyone? Oh, wait, one question, chat. I can assume you can also change the duration as well. That's correct, yes. So if you are specifying a different transition for one state and a different transition for a second state, you can use different durations. So let's say we wanted to pop in over 500 milliseconds, but when we're done with it, we want it to go back over 100 milliseconds. So we pop in 500 milliseconds, go back 100 milliseconds. So yeah, these values are independent. You can set them to whatever you want. They can be, you can set one to one value, the other one to another value. Okay, any other questions? Nope, nope. Okay, awesome. So let's move on to the second portion of this. We are going to, and I'll send a link to this in chat. Now, maybe don't look at the link if the video is not lagging. If the video is lagging for you, you can look at the link. But so what we have here is just a simple example of a ball that on an interval is moving 50 pixels at a time. So it's moving to the right 50 pixels. When it reaches the edge, it's moving back 50 pixels. So all you really have to know is that we're updating the left position by 50 pixels when it's going one way and 50 pixels when it's going the other way. This should be similar to you in the way you approached the snake game. Now, what if we wanted this animation to be smooth? So rather than jumping 50 pixels at a time, what if we want to smooth out this animation? So let's think about this. We are updating our left position on the interval. So every time the interval runs, we're saying, okay, left is now 50, 100, 150, 200, 250. And when it reaches the end, it starts counting down. So let's say it's 500, 450, 400, 350. So if we want to transition that element or animate that element from one state to another, we can just set a transition looking at the left CSS property, and we can say, oh, we want it to happen over 0.5 seconds. So if we go ahead and save that, nothing will happen because we spelt transition wrong. Okay, so if we save that, so now you can see something's happening. It is moving. It's moving in a rather weird way, but it is animating this left value every time it changes. So let's think about why it might be stuttering like this. The first reason might be our animation is taking 500 milliseconds to complete. So every time the value updates to go from one state to another, it takes 500 milliseconds. If we take a look at our interval, our interval is triggering every 300 milliseconds. So every 300 milliseconds, our snake's position is updated, but our animation is taking 500 milliseconds to complete. So before the snake animation is able to complete, it's already updating its value and going on to the next state. So first thing that we could do is maybe match up our transition to equal what our interval is. So our value updates every 300 milliseconds, and now our left position animates over 300 milliseconds. So it looks a little better, but not by much. So let's think about what might be happening. What is the default timing function that's used on a transition if you don't specify one? That's right, it's ease. So ease is the function, and if we remember what ease does, it animates our value by starting slow, going quickly, and then finishing by tapering down towards the end. So if we take a look at our dot here on the screen, what it's actually doing is every time the value changes, it's slowly building up speed and then slowing down as it reaches this new value. And it's doing that over and over again every time a new value is updated. So what's a way to fix this? Instead of using that ease, we sort of want it to transition from one state to another in a linear fashion. So we don't want it to increase or decrease speed as it changes from one value to the next. So let's go ahead and just set linear as our timing function. And now if you see our dot, it's smoothly moving because there is no increased and decreased speed as it animates from one value to another. So yeah, so this is one method that you can use. It's literally one line of code. You saw we didn't change anything in the JavaScript. One line of code will take your snake animation from jumping by 50 pixels at a time to smoothly moving across the screen. Okay, so there is update to transition. Okay, there is one other thing we could look at. This is a good point to start talking about performance in animation. So this is all good, but what is actually happening under the hood in the browser here? Definitely a topic that could take hours to explain, but to give you a quick summary, every time an element changes in your viewport, the browser has to recalculate where every item is on the page, what changed, and rasterize a new picture for you to see. So it's doing all this crazy work under the hood to render a new frame every time something changes. When we have a ball moving across the screen like this, the browser is literally rendering a new frame every time that ball moves to a new position. So it is doing a lot of calculations as this ball moves. So let's take a look at a diagram that I drew. Let me go into the iPad. Okay, so if we take a look here, the browser under the hood, to render each one of those frames, it goes through something called the critical rendering path. And the critical rendering path is essentially what the browser does every time it needs to render a new frame to display in your viewport. We're not going to worry too much about this JS and CSS portion of the critical rendering path, but we'll talk about the last three parts. Okay, so if inside of your CSS, you updated the width, the height, or the position property, and the position property includes top, left, bottom, right. When the browser needs to render a new frame for you, it's going to jump into this portion of the critical rendering path. And what does that mean? It's going to have to trigger the layout, it's going to have to paint, and it's going to have to run the composite layer to return you a new frame. Okay? If we only edit a background color or background image, a font color, some shadows, or some clipping, your browser is going to jump into this point in the critical rendering path, and it's going to have to paint and run the composite part of the critical rendering path before it needs to render a new frame. Now, there's only two properties that only trigger the composite layer in the critical rendering path, and that's opacity and transform. So if you change the opacity or transform of an object in your browser will jump into here to render a new frame. And then all it needs to do is run composite, and then it can return your new frame. So why is all this important? The less work your browser has to do, the faster your animations are going to run, the less jank and like jitter you're going to get in your animations. So if your browser has to go through layout, paint, and composite every time it needs to render a new frame, that's a ton of work. We don't want the browser to do all that work. So as much as possible, we want to try to stick to this composite layer. I mean, maybe the paint layer, but try to stick to the composite layer as much as you can to prevent the browser from having to do a ton of work under the hood every time an element moves a pixel on your screen. So some of you might be thinking, what the heck can I do with opacity and transform? Like, that's just two CSS properties. That's not a lot of stuff to work with. What kind of animations can we create with those two? So let's actually take a look. We're going to go over to MDN and we will look for transform. So opacity, we know what it does. It can just make your, change the opacity on an element. So we can make it transparent. The transform, however, has, again, these function values that you could assign to it that do a whole bunch of stuff. So one of them is we could translate. And what that means is we could move it on the x-axis and the y-axis from its original position. So we could change where our element is appearing. We can scale it. Again, we could scale it on the x-axis or on the y-axis or both. So we're able to move our element. We could scale our element. We could rotate our element. We could skew our element. Or we could combine any of these function values together to do multiple things at once. So for instance, this one is scaling it to 50%, and it's moving it 100% of its width backwards and 100% of its height. So it's moving it from the center over 100% and up 100%. So you can combine a bunch of these transforms. So now that we know that, we want to try to only stick to opacity and transform in our animations if we want things to run smooth, to prevent the browser from having to do a lot of work under the hood. So that's animation performance. Any questions on animation performance? Nope. What about any questions on our snake movement animation that we did. I forgot to ask if there was any questions. No, awesome, man, a smart group. Okay, so next we're gonna take a look at another animation that we could do with transition. This one will be a little bit different. So first we're gonna take a look at the final outcome. So we have this circle with eyes. It's supposed to be a snake head. And when we click on it, it takes a bite or its mouth opens. Now, yeah, so its mouth opens. Every time we click, it's like it takes a bite. So we're gonna take a look at how to create this from scratch using transitions. So let's go ahead and go to our working file. And I will send that working file link to you guys in chat. Sorry, I forgot the last one. There we go. Again, if the video is okay, watch the video. If it's not, you can take a look at the link. So we're starting with two images. One image is the snake head and one image is the snake mouth. And right now they're just side by side. In our CSS, we're not doing much. All we're doing is resetting the default browser margin styles on the body. We are centering the elements in the center of the body, and we're setting a background color. So this is nothing you have to worry about. It's nothing new here. We only have these two images. Okay, so before I do any animation, what I like to do is draw out my approach. So let's take a look at how we should approach this animation. Let's grab the pencil. Okay, so the H, so the yellow box with the H is the head, and the green box with the M is the mouth. So the first thing we want to do in step one here, we want to create a wrapper around our two elements. After we've created a wrapper around our two elements, we want to position the head element to be directly above our mouth element. So this 3/4 view here shows that the head is directly above our mouth element. And in step 3 here, you see what we're doing? We're actually taking the head and scaling it on the y-axis so that it shrinks to reveal the layer underneath. So the head is shrinking height-wise, and it's revealing the mouth that's underneath, which will give us this effect of the snake is opening its mouth. And this is the type of thing that you'll notice a lot in animations where it's trickery and deception. It's all a bunch of tricks, really easy tricks that anybody can do. Okay, so let's see if we can create this layout inside of our HTML. So the first thing that we saw is that there was some sort of container wrapping our two elements. So let's go ahead and call that container snake. And let's put our head and our mouth inside of that container. Okay, so this is the structure that we drew. Now, let's go ahead and define these classes in here so that we could apply some styles to them. So first we have the snake class, then we have the snake head class, and we also have the snake mouth class. Okay, so step 1. The parent container, we want to give it a width. So let's give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Okay, and as we remember, we want to position the head directly above the mouth. How can we do that? Well, to take it out of the flow of the page, we can set its position to absolute and set its top position to 0 and its left position to 0. Okay, that looks great, right? Because our snake head is no longer contained in another container, it doesn't know what width it needs to be. So it's growing to all the available space that it has. So let's go ahead and give our snake head a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Okay, much better, right? No, it's the snake head is up here. We wanted it to be directly above the mouth. So why is this happening? Okay, so whenever you set the position on an element to be absolute, so right now we're saying we want it to be absolute at the top left-hand corner of something. But what is that something that we're trying to position it relative to? So this sort of works the same way that variables work in JavaScript. So it's kind of like scope. Okay, we want to position this absolutely. We need to see what is this relative to? So we start traversing through the parents. So we check to see, okay, snake, is snake set to position relative or absolute? No, it's not. Okay, so it's not relative to this element. And we would keep traversing out on the parent elements to see what is the first element that has a position set to absolute or relative. And the first element that has that position absolute or relative, this position will be relative to that element. If we reach the body and no parents had a position relative or absolute, your element is going to be position absolute relative to the body. And that's why you see our snake head appearing in the top 0, left 0 position of our body rather than our snake. So to fix this, what we need to do is we need to set our parent to be position relative. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell the snake head, hey, this positioning here, that's actually relative to its parent, the snake. Okay, and just to make sure that, that our element or our mouth element below still exists and that it's actually working, we'll set the opacity to 50%. So you can see, yes, indeed, there is a mouth element underneath. Okay, so next step, we talked about potentially scaling this head element on the y-axis to reveal some of the mouth. So how do we do that? We can use, as we remember from, well, we might not remember because there's a lot of stuff, but from MDN, the transform property had the scale function value that we could use. So let's go transform, and we're going to scale it on the y-axis. We want to scale it to 50% of its initial size. And when we do that, you see the head image scales to 50% of its initial size, and it reveals that mouth image that's hidden underneath. Okay, so this is great, but it's not interactive. This sucks. Okay, so let's try to make this interactive. So let's see. Let's first start by making this happen on hover. So let's say when we hover over the snake head, so so on hover on the snake head, we want to scale back the size of this snake head element. Okay, so right now what happens when we hover over, you see that the mouth opens. Not very interesting. It's kind of sharp. It happens too abruptly. So let's go ahead and use what we learned in the first part of this talk, the transition. So we're going to set the transition to keep an eye on the transform so that if it ever changes, we interpolate between the two values. And let's say we want it to happen over 0.5 seconds. So now when we hover over our element, you'll see that the mouth opens and closes. So it's got a nice ease to it. It animates between the values rather than just jumping from one value to the next. Okay, so this is all good on hover, but what if inside of our JavaScript, we actually wanted to trigger this on, I don't know, let's say we got close to a mouse or we're eating an apple or something. You don't want to have to hover over this every time it gets close to an apple so that it looks like the snake is biting. That would be silly. So instead of having this happen on hover, let's say we want this animation to happen anytime our snake head has this class or this active class. Okay, so anytime our snake head receives this class or anytime we put that class on snakehead, it will open its mouth. So let's go over to our JavaScript. And the first thing we want to do is we want to get a reference to our snake head. And we're going to use document. We're going to use the query selector method. And we are going to tell it what class we're looking for. So what element has, or what element, we're looking for the element that contains this class, sorry. So we're looking for the element that contains the snakehead class, and that's what we're gonna reference using this snakehead variable. So let's say that we actually want this class to be added and removed on click. So we're gonna have to add an event listener to our snakehead. So add event listener. So we're gonna add an event listener and we're gonna listen to the click event. And every time the click event happens, we're gonna want to invoke some sort of callback. So we're gonna want something to happen. So let's go ahead and say we want to invoke a function called byte every time somebody clicks on this snakehead element. Okay, so let's fill out this function. What do we want it to do? Well, we want it to add a class, right? So let's say on our snake head element, we can access the class list property. And the class list property has a few methods that are really helpful when it comes to adding, removing, and toggling classes. So we can say add, and what that's going to do is it's going to add a class for us every time this byte function is invoked. So let's say we want to add the snake head active class. If we go ahead and save, and now we click on the snake head, it adds that active class. And if we click on it again, nothing happens because every time we click on it, it's invoking this byte function, which is trying to add a class. So once we've added the class, nothing else can happen. We're just trying to add a class that already exists there. So it's not going to close its mouth. So let's think about how would we go about getting the snake to close its mouth now? Well, we know that we would have to remove the class to get it to go back to its original position. So can we just do something like this? We add a class and then we remove it. So let's click on it and nothing's happening. And the reason why nothing is happening is because we're adding the class and then right away, like the next tick, we're removing the class. So it doesn't even have a chance to trigger the animation. We're adding it, removing it. So what's one way that we could solve this? Well, maybe we don't remove the class right away. Maybe we wait some set amount of time before we remove the class. So what's one way that we could do that? We can use a set timeout. Okay, and the set timeout will take a callback and a time or a set amount of time that we want to wait before we invoke this callback. So let's do this. So now we have a timeout. So anytime we invoke the byte function, we're going to add a class, we're going to wait 500 milliseconds, and then we're going to remove the class. So let's see what happens. We click on it, and after 500 milliseconds, it closes its mouth. So it is biting. But now, is this the best way to go about this? Let's say one of your annoying coworkers comes along like a week later, and they go into the CSS and they're like, oh, this byte animation sucks. It's way too slow. Let's speed it up. So they change it to be 900 milliseconds. And now when somebody clicks on your snake animation, it's not doing anything. Actually, sorry, that's scaling to here. When they increase the duration to 900 milliseconds and you click on your snake head, you see that it's glitchy now. And why is it glitchy? Because the animation is trying to take 900 milliseconds to transition between the values, but our timeout is updating the value after 500 milliseconds. So again, our animation does not have enough time to complete. It's just jumping. So one way to fix it would be to set this to 900 now. But if your annoying coworker doesn't know that this is also linked to something in the JavaScript, they're not going to know to change that, and it's going to end up breaking your element. So is there a better way to go about this than using a timeout with a fixed value to remove this class? The answer is yes. The CSS transition property actually gives us a few events that we could listen to know when certain things have happened to this transition. So let's go to MDN, and I believe it's called a transition event. Okay, so let's take a look here. There's 4 events. There's transition cancel, transition end, transition run, and transition start. Now, unfortunately, 3 of these are not cross-browser. So there's no point in using them because they don't work in Safari. So those people are going to miss out on our fun animations. Fortunately, one of them is cross-browser, and it's the best one, transition end. What transition end allows us to do is to listen when a transition has completed. So in our JavaScript here, instead of setting this timeout, what we could do is we could say, hey, on snakehead, let's add a new event listener, and let's listen to the transition end event. And when that transition end event triggers or fires, we are going to want to remove this class. So no more timeout. Now our removing of the class is no longer tied to any magic number value. So it's not tied to like a hard-coded 900 milliseconds. Instead, what it's going to do is, depending on how long this transition is going to take to complete, It will wait, and after this is completed, it will go ahead and remove the class. So let's take a look. When we click on it, it takes 900 milliseconds to open, and as soon as it's finished opening, it will close. So if we go ahead in our CSS and update this value to say, oh, now we want it, you know, my coworker got fired because he was really annoying, and now we want to put it back to 500 milliseconds. So now when we click on it, mouth opens and closes, no problem. We didn't have to update this secondary value in JavaScript. So takeaway from this, there is one event that you could listen to on your transitions that is cross-browser, and it's a very useful one, something that you will use quite often. Now, some of you people that are very keen might notice that this event listener is actually triggering every time a transition ends, right? So when the mouth opens, it fires, and when the mouth closes, it fires again. But luckily, this remove method, what it is actually doing under the hood is it first checks to see, does that class exist on this element? And if it doesn't, it's just not going to do anything. If it does, it will remove it. So it's doing a check for you. It's not unnecessarily going to throw an error saying, hey, there's no class to remove here. If there isn't one, it'll just skip over it. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so that's how to listen for the transition end event, and how to create this animation where a snake opens and closes its mouth on click. And again, it doesn't have to be on click. You can trigger this bite animation on anything you want. You run into a wall, trigger the bite function. You run into an apple, trigger the bite function. You run into the snake, trigger the bite function. It doesn't matter. You can trigger this function whenever you want, and it will fire off this animation. Let's see. So Lanre asks, what are the use cases for the other transition events? So I don't want to get too much into it because they're not supported across all browsers, but you can read on MDN. So you can see like transition cancel is an event fired when a CSS transition has been canceled. So let's say we started hovering over something, or we started clicking, but the animation was interrupted midway. So the animation was canceled midway. That event would fire if your animation was interrupted. Transition run, so an event that's fired when CSS transition is created, when it's added to a set of running transitions, even though, sorry, an event fired when a CSS transition is created. Okay, so whenever a transition is created, transition run will fire. I'm not 100% sure what created means. Like maybe if it starts running, or is it when you, it would make sense that it fires when you create it in your CSS. So I would say go and read up more on this. And transition start, it's when a transition has started transitioning. So, but yeah, feel free to look up transition event on MDN and read what the other events that are emitted from the transition CSS property do. Any other questions on the transition end or the snake mouth open animation? Let's see, how did you make the SVGs for the snake head and mouth? Oh, interesting question. Okay, we won't get too much into that, but these were created in Illustrator. Let's see, if you open up if we open up Illustrator, do I have these images anywhere? No, but I can probably just save it here. Okay, so if we open up this snake head image in Illustrator, it's missing some properties. You won't be able to see it. But essentially, I draw out these shapes inside of Illustrator, and then you can go ahead and export out of Illustrator as an SVG, which you could use in your code. Yeah? Okay. Okay, I'll close Illustrator because it'll make my computer explode. Okay, so now we're going to look at a third way to use transition to animate something. And this is going to build up on all the stuff that we've learned so far, and it will teach us a few new things. So here is the completed version of what we're going to try to build now. Inside of this square, if we click on it, you'll see that a hole opens, or it's like a portal, and a mouse comes out of it. And when we click on it again, the mouse goes back into this portal, and the portal closes. And this is the same animation that was used on the snake game. So As with anything else, that's going to be the final example. We're going to go into the working file, and to get started, all we have is a mouse image, which we created in Illustrator and exported as an SVG. It has a mouse image class on it, and same stuff on the body, where we're just resetting the browser default margins on the body, setting a background color, and centering anything inside the body vertically and horizontally. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, just like with our other animation, we're going to start out by drawing out how we envision this animation working, because getting started by coding is not the best way to go about these things. You really have to put some thought into it to kind of map it out first. Okay, if we look at step 1, so this step right here, I think everybody knows what a 1 is. There's 4 elements. We have this purple element, this one here, where it's got an O in the top corner. What that's going to be is a container that we use as an overflow, and I'll explain what that means in a second. We're going to have another container, which will be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and this is going to be our parent container, or the container that contains all of our other elements. Then we're going to have this portal container, and we're going to have our mouse image, which is this last one. Okay, so let's talk about some of these elements in more detail. So this overflow container, what is going to be the point of having this overflow container? If we look at number 2, what we could do is we could say, hey, any children inside of this overflow container, if they go out of bounds of our container, let's make them invisible so that you can't see them. And any children that go into the bounds of this container, they'll be visible. So it's almost like a cloak, where anything inside of this container is visible, anything outside of it is not visible. Let's switch over to step 4 first. And step 4 is just showing us how this structure is going to work. So we're going to have our mouse container, so our parent container first. And inside of that parent container, we're going to have our overflow container. Sorry, that's this one. And then inside of that overflow container, we're going to have our portal, and we're going to have our image. And we'll see that more in CSS. So let's go back and take a look at step 3 now. So we have these 4 containers. We have the nested structure of how we want them to be nested. But what step 3 shows us is how do we want to position them? Well, so our M, or our mouse container, is the first parent container. And that could just sit anywhere on the page. In this case, it will sit in the middle of the body since we're centering everything. Then inside of our mouse container, we have our overflow container, which is this big purple box here. And we want to position this overflow container to sit at the bottom center of our mouse container. Okay. And then inside of that overflow container, we have our portal, which we also want to sit at the bottom center of our overflow container. And finally, we have our image, which we want to sit just below our overflow container. So this is the image here, and it's sitting just below our overflow container. So if you remember step 2, where anything outside of the overflow container is not visible, by default, our mouse will not be visible. If this is a little bit confusing, it might start making a little bit more sense once we get into the code. But don't worry, this isn't stuff that you could pick up in a day, or some of you probably will, but don't worry if you don't. This is something that takes practice, but it's good to see how this is done so that when you do start practicing, you have an idea of how somebody goes about building out one of these animations. So first, in our HTML, let's go ahead and build out that structure that we set. So first, we had a parent container. Let's go ahead and call it mouse. And inside of that mouse container, we said we wanted a overflow container. Okay, so we have our overflow container. And then inside of that overflow container, we had our portal. Okay, so there's our portal. And then also inside of the overflow container, we had our image. So mouse is the parent, the mouse has an overflow in it, and inside of the overflow, we have the portal and the image. So just like every other step, now let's go ahead and define these classes inside our style sheet so that we could apply some styles to our elements. So first we have the mouse, Then we have the mouse overflow. Then we have the mouse portal. Whoops. And finally, we have the mouse image. Okay, so let's start with the parent container, or the mouse. According to our diagram, we wanted it to have a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. We're also going to go ahead and put borders on everything so that you guys can see, actually let's make it gray, so that you guys can see what's actually happening with all of these containers. So we have our mouse, it's got a border, a width, and a height. Now, our overflow container was much larger. We want to give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And let's also set a border of maybe 1 pixel solid red. Okay, so there's our overflow container. And we might remember that we wanted this overflow container to actually be positioned at the bottom center of our mouse container. So how do we do that? Well, let's take it out of flow, or out of the context, by positioning it absolutely. And where do we want to position it? We want to position it at the bottom. So we'll set bottom to 0, which should align it to the bottom of the container. But we run into this issue again where, oh no, it's actually, the position is relative to the body and not its parent. And if we remember, that's because none of the parents, so this overflow container, none of the parents are set to position relative or absolute. So our positioning is relative to the body. So to fix that, if we want it to be relative to mouse, we need to set the mouse container to be position relative. And now we see that our overflow container is aligned to the bottom edge of the container. So now we want to position it at the bottom center though. So let's set left to 50%. And what you might see is, oh, it's in the center, but it's in the center relative to the left edge. So that's a little weird. We actually wanted to center this entire container and not the left edge, because this doesn't look like it's centered to me inside of that container. So to fix this, and this is something that you'll probably use hundreds and hundreds of times in your code, what you want to do is you want to say, okay, it's in the center, but we want to offset it. So we want to push it back 50% of the width of this container. So essentially we want to say, hey, push it back 50%, or 50% of the width of the current container. So to do that, we could set a transform and a translate x. So what translate x is doing is saying, hey, let's move our element on the x-axis. And how far back do we want to move it? We want to move it 50% of its width. So it moves this element back 50% of its width. And that gives us a true centering inside of our mouse container. So that's our overflow for now. Next, let's work on our portal. So our portal, we said we wanted its width to be 100 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. Let's also go ahead and give it a border, maybe 1 pixel solid, let's go blue this time. Okay, so there's our portal. But again, if we remember from our diagram, we want to position this portal at the bottom center of our overflow container. So again, we set its position to absolute. We set its bottom to 0, which will position it at the bottom edge. And we set its left position to 50%, which will align it to the center, but based on the left edge. Again, if we want to truly center it, we need to push it back 50% of its width on the x-axis. And to do that, we could use the transform, translate x, and we want to go back 50% of this element's width, or we want to move back 50% of this element's width. So now our portal is in the correct place. And lastly, we have our mouse image. So we want to give our mouse image a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels. And if we remember, oh, let's also give it a border, 1 pixel solid, let's say purple. And if we remember, we wanted to position the mouse just out of view along the bottom edge of our overflow container. So to do that, we can say, we're going to set its position to absolute, and we're going to set its top position to 100%. And what does setting it to 100% do? It says, hey, from the top position of this relative container, let's set its top position to be 100% of the parent container's value. So it's essentially saying 100% equals this container's height. So we're saying put it 100% distance away from the top. So it puts it right here. It might be a little bit confusing at first. I would suggest maybe just going around if you're not comfortable with positioning stuff, and play around with the position value and see what happens when you use pixel values, percentage values, just to kind of wrap your head around what's happening. Because I could see if I didn't understand what position was, I would be going, what the heck is happening right now? Okay, so we have it positioned just outside of the bottom edge of our overflow container. And we also want to center it. So again, we do the trick where we say left 50, but it only aligns it to the left edge. So we need to say transform, translate X, and we want to go back 50% on the X axis. So now our mouse is in the correct position. And if we pull down our iPad, now this sort of looks like what we drew in step 3. So again, that's why it's important to draw stuff out to kind of visualize what you're going to do before you start going into code, because you could spend hours trying to get your animation to work in code when you could just spend minutes trying to visualize it and figure out how things should move on a piece of paper. Okay, so now that we have our positioning correct, let's go ahead and start filling out our elements. Let's start with the portal, because it doesn't look much like a portal right now. So first we'll start by giving it a background color, and the background color will be black. Okay, and now to make this look more like a portal, we can round it by using the border radius CSS property and setting its value to 50%. Now, for those of you not familiar with border radius, what it does is if you only provide one value, it will set the border radius on the top left-hand corner, the top right-hand corner, the bottom left, bottom right-hand corner, and bottom left-hand corner to 50%. And where does 50% come from? Well, if you're setting it on the left, it's 50% of the element's width. So it's rounding this corner to 50% of the element's width, which gives you, like, I guess it's an ellipse shape. Okay, so we no longer need this border because we could see where our portal is. Next step, let's think about how are we going to end up moving our mouse so that it looks like it's coming out of the portal. Well, if we want to move this mouse element up, like let's say by 50 pixels for now, how can we do that? Well, we do have that function value of translate Y that we can say, hey, we want to move it back 50 pixels on the Y value. And this is where you see us starting to combine these function values. So remember, transform can rotate, scale, move stuff, and you can combine those as long as you separate them with a space. So we're moving it on the x-axis, and then we're moving it on the y-axis. So this doesn't look too good for now, right? But so let's deal with this overflow container. So what we talked about earlier is that anything outside of this overflow container should not be visible. So all the children outside of this container should not be visible. All the children inside of this container should be visible. So if we take a look at our overflow container, we can set the CSS property of overflow hidden. And what that's going to do is it's going to say, hey, if any of your children go outside of the bounds of your container, let's just hide them. We're not going to make them visible. If the children are within the bounds of your container, they will be visible. Okay, so that takes care of the overflow. But now some of you might be noticing, oh, that's a little weird. If we just move this mouse from this position up top, you're going to actually end up seeing the mouse's nose and maybe the ears as they come up from the bottom of this portal. To some people that might be okay, but I think that would look really silly. So how do we actually mask this part here? Well, in this case, we don't have to clip, we don't have to mask, we could just use a trick. How about we change our overflow container, which is this red container here, to be a circle rather than a square. And if we remember what we did on the portal, to change something so that it's an ellipse or a circle, depending on its size, we could just use the border radius CSS property. So if we set the border radius to 50%, it sets the border radius on the left, the top left, the top right, the bottom right, and the bottom left to be 50%. And if we take a look at our image now, because the radius of this overflow container matches somewhat, not exactly, to this portal container, our mouse it doesn't look like it's going outside of the portal anymore. So it kind of appears like, oh, maybe it is coming out of the portal. So what would the next step be? So instead of having our mouse just come out halfway, how about on hover of our parent mouse container? So let's say on hover of our parent mouse container, we want our image container to do something, our image element to do something. And what do we want it to do? We want it to move up on the y-axis by 100 pixels. So when we hover over our mouse container, our mouse is going to move up, as we see here, or translate up on the y-axis by negative 100 pixels. So it'll go up by 100 pixels. Now, this is kind of cool, but it's not fun. So we could jump back to that thing we learned in the beginning where we could use a transition now. So on our mouse image, we could set the transition. Yeah, that's how you spell it. And what do we want to listen to? We want to listen to the transform CSS property. And let's say over 500 milliseconds, anytime the transform changes, so on hover, it's going to change because our translate y is going to update to minus 100. We want it to animate from its initial value to its new value over a period of 500 milliseconds. So let's go ahead and hover over our mouse now. And you see that our mouse is coming out of the hole and going back into the hole. Pretty cool, right? But wait, there's more. Okay, so let's see. The mouse is coming in and out, but we want the portal maybe to open up and then the mouse to come out. So if also on hover, we wanted our portal to open up so that our mouse could come out of it, we might want to start by saying, hey, the default state, we don't want our portal to be visible. We want it to be closed in the default state. So again, in transform, remember one of the function values that we could use was scale. Scale, there we go. And what we could do is we could say, hey, scale it to 0% of its initial size. So right now it's 0% of its initial size. So it's hidden. The mouse is there, but the portal no longer exists. So if we want the portal to appear, we could say, hey, when we hover over our mouse parent element, we want something to happen to our mouse portal element. And what do we want to happen? Well, we want to scale it back to its original size, or to its 100% of its original size. Okay, so now if we hover over the mouse element, you'll see that the portal does indeed appear. So that's great. When we hover, it is going back to its original size, but it looks kind of choppy. So that's because we do not have a transition on our mouse portal. So I hope you guys are seeing like a common occurring thing here where you want to make something look cool, use transition. Okay, so we want to transition something. What do we want to transition? We want to listen for the transform. So anytime the transform value changes of our mouse portal element, we want it to animate to its new value over a duration of, let's say 0.3 seconds. Okay, so now if we hover over our parent container, we see that our portal opens and our mouse comes in. But this looks kind of silly. It's the portal's opening as the mouse is coming up, so it doesn't even look like the mouse is coming out of the portal. Some people might call it quits now, and they'll be like, yeah, this is great. There's a mouse coming out of a portal, but we don't do stuff at Codesmith like that. So let's make this look a little bit better. Okay, so what's the first thing we want to do? Maybe we want this portal to open first and the mouse to come out after the portal has opened. So how can we do that? Well, we could make use of that delay value that we talked about earlier. So on our mouse image, instead of it coming in right away, we can say, hey, we're listening for the transform to change, and we want the animation to happen over 0.5 seconds, but we don't want this animation to start right away. We want it to start after 300 milliseconds instead. So it's not going to start animating till 300 milliseconds, which gives our portal enough time to open up. Okay, so now when we hover over the mouse, you see the portal opens up and the mouse comes out of the portal. Looks much, much better. But you might be noticing when we hover off of our animation, it's doing the same thing. So the mouse is waiting 300 milliseconds, and then it's transitioning to its initial value, and the portal's closing right away. So that does not look right at all. So if we want to fix that, let's think about it. So our hover states are correct, but our initial states are incorrect, or initial transitions are incorrect. So let's see, the first thing we probably want to happen is we don't want our mouse to wait, or we don't want there to be any sort of delay on our mouse when we hover off of our element. So we can see here, we're waiting 300 milliseconds right there. So if we think that when we hover onto the element, that's perfectly fine, what we could do is we could copy this transition, copy this transition onto the hover state, and on the non-hovered state, we can say, hey, we don't need a delay here. When we're hovering over it, sure, we could have a delay to have the portal open up first, but when we are not hovering, we don't need a delay. So let's take a look at what that causes this animation to do. We hover over it, the portal opens, and the mouse comes out of the portal. When we hover off of it, the mouse disappears right away. So, I mean, that's good, but our portal is still doing something strange. And what it's doing is it's actually just disappearing right away. It's not even waiting for our mouse to go into the portal before it closes. So that's not very nice of the portal to do that. So the current transition that we have on the portal, where it listens for the transform and takes 300 milliseconds to animate, that's correct for the hover state, but on the non-hovered state, we actually want it to wait a little bit before it closes. So let's go ahead and copy this over to the hover state because it's fine on hover, but on our non-hovered state, maybe we want to wait, let's say 300 milliseconds to give our mouse friend some time to go into the hole before we close the portal on it. Okay, whoops. So if we hover over now, our portal opens and our mouse comes in, and when we hover off of it, our mouse goes into the portal and the portal closes. Looks great. Okay, so next step, let's take off these borders so that we can see this animation a little bit better. And then we will do one more thing. Okay, so when we hover over this element, you see the mouse comes in. When we hover off of it, the mouse leaves. Okay, so this is great on a hover, but again, just like our snake bite animation, what if we want this to happen on some sort of JavaScript event? Well, the answer to that is instead of on hover, let's say we want this to happen anytime our parent container has a mouse active class on it. So instead of on hover, what we're actually doing is we're saying, hey, I only want this animation to trigger when this parent has this mouse active class on it. So we jump to our JavaScript, and the first thing we want to do is get a reference to our mouse. And we're going to use the query selector method once again. And we are going to target our, what was this thing called? It's the mouse. So we're going to target our mouse. So now we have a reference to our mouse container. And what do we want to do? Well, we're not going to trigger it on hover anymore. So maybe we could trigger it on click for now. And then in the future, you guys could change this to hover on whatever event you want it to trigger on. So if we want to trigger this on click, we're going to say, we're going to add an event listener. And the event listener that we're going to be listening for is the click event. And when we click on our mouse container, we're going to want to do something. So let's say we want to toggle the mouse. And so we want to invoke a callback that's going to be called toggle mouse. And what I envision this toggle mouse callback to do is when we click on it, we're going to add the class. And when we click on it again, we're going to remove the class. And what that'll do is, remember, if the class is active, our mouse is going to appear. If the class is inactive, our mouse is going to hide. So we are going to fill out our toggle mouse function. And in here, so if we want our mouse to show up, what do we need to do? We need to add a class to our mouse container. So just like before, we could target the class list property. And remember, it has an add, it has a remove method, but it also has a really helpful toggle method. And what toggle does is it checks to see if the class is present on your element. If it isn't, it will add it. If it is, it will remove it. So it will just toggle your class on and off every time you click. And we'll see this in action in a second. So what do we want to do? We want to toggle a class of mouse active. Okay, so if we go ahead and save this, now when we click on our mouse element, our click event is going to fire, which is going to trigger this callback, this toggle mouse callback, which is going to toggle a mouse active class. So when we click on it, nothing happens because there's an error somewhere. Listener, shoot. No, it's not. Is it capital L?
Yeah, capital L.
Oh, damn. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, hold on. Okay, save it. Let's see what happens. So now when we click on our mouse element, our class is added. And when that class is active, it's updating our styles to show our mouse. And when you click on it again, our mouse goes into the portal and hides. So this is, all this is a toggle mouse function, very basic. If you wanted this to happen, let's say your snake is about to run into your mouse, you just trigger the toggle mouse function. And if you wanted something else to happen, like let's say, oh, we want to hide it, so we want to remove the class and then maybe like update its position, and then we want to show the class. You can go ahead and do something like that. But again, with these animations, it's like whatever you can imagine, you can do. So that is our third and final example of how you can use the transition CSS property. Hopefully by now you guys can see that although it is just a single CSS property, it allows you to do like all sorts of crazy stuff. And because we're only changing these transition values rather than say like a top, a left, or a position, it's very, it's not generous, it's very optimal for the browser to re-render these animations or these changes that are happening to the browser. One last thing that I forgot to cover, at least I think I forgot to cover, is that some of you might be wondering why this transition CSS property is able to take multiple values when most of our other CSS properties only take one value. So width takes a single value, height takes a single value, but transition could take up to 4 values. And why is that the case? That is because transition is actually something called a CSS shorthand property. And what that means is that it is actually a collection of other CSS properties bundled into one. So setting transition is the same as saying, hey, we want to transition this property for this duration using this timing function, using this delay. So all it is a short form for defining each of these properties individually. Now, unless you really like typing a lot of code, I would say stick with the shorthand property, shorthand property, sorry. And this might look familiar for some of you that might have used the border CSS shorthand property. So when we do stuff like this, 1 pixel solid red, that is actually a shorthand property for defining the border width, the border style, and the border color. So anytime you see any CSS properties that contain more than one value, chances are it is a CSS shorthand property. Okay, so that's the last example. Hopefully by now, some of you guys know what transition does. If not, shoot me a message on Slack and I'll try to explain again. So the next step, let's actually take a look at, so that's one way to manipulate elements inside of the browser using this one CSS property. There are probably 10 or probably more, I don't know, there's probably more, but there's like probably like 10 main other methods that you can use to animate your properties in the browser. And I'll go over them in like quickly, so we don't have to talk about them a lot, but because these would take their own 2-hour lectures to explain. So one of them is something called keyframe animation in CSS. And what keyframe animations allow you to do is set an animation where instead of transitioning from one value to another value, you can actually define intermediary, I don't know what word to use, like multiple values in the transition. So in this case, what you see here is we're saying, hey, in this animation, when we start, we want its color to be green at 25% of the duration of the animation. So it's over 2 seconds. Let's make it 1 second to make this easier to explain. So at 0% of 1 second, it's green. At 25% of 1 second, it's red. At 75% of 1 second, it's purple and green. So you can see we're cycling through multiple values here. So this allows you to manipulate. And again, we're just doing one thing here. If we wanted, we could say, hey, we also want the width to change to 100 pixels here. So this gives you a way to create more of like a timeline animation. Now, the reason why I'm not going to spend too much time on this one is because it's something that I rarely use. You can probably do what this is doing with some other, not frameworks, but libraries that will make this process a lot easier. This is something that I maybe reach for once, I don't know, every 6 months to do an animation. But just so you know that this exists, and if you see it out in the wild, these are called keyframe animations. If you want more information about keyframe animations, or you're curious, just go to MDN and look at the keyframe animation section. And it'll explain it way better than I can. Okay, so that's keyframe animation. The second way is something called the GreenSock animation platform. And this is where it starts to get really cool. So we have this interactive button here where when we hover over it, you see a whole bunch of stuff changes, or it might not look like a whole bunch of stuff is changing, but it is. So what's actually happening is the mouth is growing in size. This black portion of the mouth moves up, the teeth move up, the tongue moves in, the ears move back, the eyes move down and over to the right. So all of those items are moving or transitioning. And can you imagine if you wanted to use the transition CSS property to update all these elements, the delays and the properties that you would have to set and keep track of what's doing what. And then if for some reason you're like, oh, I want the eyes to delay by 2 seconds, now the rest of your animation is thrown off. So that would just become a total nightmare. So transition is good when you want to animate a couple elements. But when you start getting into more complex animations like this, where you're transitioning like 10 elements, something like the GreenSock animation platform is a lot better to use. And to just give you a quick sneak peek of how the code looks for something like this is it's a timeline, and we're targeting all of our elements that we want to animate. So we have the back of the mouth, the tongue, the teeth, the body, the freckles, the ears, the right eye, the left eye, the eyes, and the nostrils. And we are doing something to each one of these elements. So for the back of the mouth here, what we're saying is, hey, we want to move it up 70 pixels on the y-axis. The tongue, we want to move it up 70 pixels on the y-axis. The teeth, we want to scale them to 120% of their size. The body, we want to scale it on the y-axis to 106% of its original size. So there's all these things happening and targeting all these elements. And if you wanted to manipulate one of these elements, you just go ahead and change the value here. If you wanted something, let's say, oh, after the freckles have moved, we want another element to move. We just go in here and add another value. So it's easy to visualize, hey, these are all my elements. This is what I'm doing to animate them. If I want to manipulate this timeline, very easy. You don't have to worry about, hey, what's the delay on my body? What's the delay on my eyes? And you don't have to traverse through all those steps to control those variables. So this gives you a very clean and easy way to do timeline animation or manipulate a lot of elements to do something at once. If you want more information about this library, there is a website, as with everything, greensock.com/gsap. So, and it's just called the GreenSock Animation Platform. And this is something that you can spend weeks learning and playing around with. I would advise you to, because this is where animation starts to get really cool and allows you to do things that you can't even dream of doing with the CSS transition property. And if you're interested in this hippo button or how to use GreenSock, I've actually created a written and a video tutorial that goes step by step on how to create this hippo button. So if you have 20 minutes or maybe hours, because you might have to pause a lot, to do this, I would say if you're interested in GreenSock, go ahead and watch the video or read the tutorial. And I'll just go ahead and send a link to this in chat. There you go. And okay, so the next one is, how would we make complex SVG animations? Whoops, I just closed the chat, sorry. Okay, so how would we make complex SVG animations? So Airbnb purchased this animation library that used to be called Body Movin', or they didn't purchase it. They hired the guy that created it and brought it on as their own, and it's called Lottie. And what Lottie allows you to do is create complex SVG animations. So if we take a look at this animation that I created here, there's a man riding a bicycle around this hill. If we start to think like, how do you get a guy to ride a bicycle using transitions? Like that's not even a thing you can do, right? That's crazy. But another thing that happens, you can move this cloud around this island, and if you hit spacebar, it starts raining. And if the biker goes into the rain, he pulls out an umbrella out of his backpack and opens it. Now, if you asked me to create that using transitions, I would probably just quit. But luckily, with this this library that this man at Airbnb created, what it allows you to do is take an SVG and bring it into a program like After Effects and create an animation inside of After Effects. So let's say we take this umbrella image and we bring it into After Effects and we animate the individual points on that umbrella to open up or close. When we're done animating it inside of After Effects, we could export that animation as a large JSON file, because it's an SVG, it's just math, as a large JSON file, and we can play back that animation inside of the browser. So I did do a write-up on this to show people the process of how this was created, and you can actually take a look. So the umbrella is just an SVG, that's an umbrella, and then it's taken into After Effects, and I manipulate the points to create this animation where the umbrella opens up. Then this umbrella animation is exported as a JSON file, and then this animation is triggered when something happens. In this case, when it's raining and the biker is in the rain, we trigger this animation to occur. Another crazy thing that you could do inside of After Effects, you can actually rig up characters to have, I guess it's like bones, and so they act like people. Like the arms will respect their current position, the legs will respect their current position. So what I did was I actually rigged up my biking character so that the arms, the shoulders, and the legs would act as they would on a person where their legs and arms were attached to their body. And I made him pedal. And then again, I just exported out this animation as a JSON file and trigger that animation to just keep looping as the bike moves around the world. So there it is. This is just some other stuff. I'll send a link to the process. You guys could play around with that. Where is the chat? Oh man, I can't find the chat. Sorry guys, no links. I'll send you the link after. Okay, and then the last type of animation that you could do. Oh, there it is. Somebody sent a chat. Perfect. Oh, there you go. Okay, thank you, Dulio. Okay, and then the last type of animation you could do, and this is when you start really learning how to do animations. You could start combining these different frameworks, these different libraries with all the different animation techniques, and you can start combining them with things like physics engines. So in this case, what I did was I combined one of my animations with a physics engine, and what it allows you to do now is I can click on this marshmallow, and it's actually got some elasticity on this wire. So you can drag it around and let it flop around because there's some physics going on there. And if you take this marshmallow, so this is a marshmallow and this is a cup of hot chocolate. If you take this marshmallow, they're friends, so they get mad if you, so if we try to melt this marshmallow, hold on, it's getting a little crazy. Okay, if we take this marshmallow and try to dip it in the hot chocolate, he gets scared and his friend, the hot chocolate cup, gets angry at you for dipping his friend. And he raises his hands because he's in distress, like a marshmallow would be when you dip them into hot chocolate. But so these are the types of things that you could start doing when you master animation and want to start combining them with with other libraries, like a physics library, for instance. And again, I did do another write-up on this. So if you want to know how this was created, it's not a tutorial, it's a write-up to kind of give you an idea of how you go about even creating an animation like this. But I will send that link in chat as well. Okay, I'm losing my voice. That was the last example. I hope you guys were able to pick up some knowledge about transitions and animations from this. And if you're curious about any specific part that I talked about, shoot me a message on Slack. I can send you links to whatever you want. Just tell me what type of animation you're interested in. If you have any questions about anything we talked about, send me a message. We could talk about it. We could jump on a video. Yeah. Any questions about anything? Anyone? No? Awesome. Okay, well, that's the talk. Nice. I don't have to worry about this anymore. I've been worrying about this for 3 days. Thanks for enduring the torture of sitting through an hour and a half of hearing somebody talk.
It was no torture. It was amazing.
Yeah, Mariusz, that was absolutely kudos to you again for taking the time, and I'm just like blown away. Like there's so much, like this is a whole course. You just like created a course. I had a little curiosity about like your naming convention on your classes for CSS. You use double underscore. Is that something that's used out in the real world?
Yeah. So that naming syntax is called BEM naming syntax. It's block element modifier, and let me send you a link to this. Now, what this helps you do, if we let's go back to one of our examples. So let's go to our working file here. So if we look at our CSS, what this helps you do is when you're not working inside of a framework where your classes matter, you don't want your classes to collide with one another, right? Like you don't want to name something mouse and then, somewhere further in your file, you have something else called mouse. What this allows you to do is sort of, I don't know what the exact term for it is, but create like a unique, it's like creating a component out of your elements. And it does a couple things well. So it creates like a component. So we know this is a mouse component. We know that this is an overflow element, which is located inside of our mouse component. This is a portal element that's located in our mouse component. And this is a modifier. So this is a modifier class that's attached to our mouse component. So it's almost like we're encapsulating this mouse element into its own little component. There's another benefit where under the hood, and I don't know how much of a benefit this is, but it is somewhere. Under the hood, because we don't have to target things like, oh, we're going to target the mouse and the overflow container, the browser doesn't need to go, okay, I need to look for the mouse container. I need to go and find the overflow container. Instead, it's just like, oh, okay, I'm just looking for the mouse container. I'm just looking for the mouse overflow container. It doesn't need to look for nested divs. So there's a slight performance optimization, but I think browsers are getting so good now that that's probably not a thing. And one other thing is that once you start getting into things like React, it's actually gonna, I guess the term is obfuscate. It's gonna create random strings for your classes when you use them in different components. So in React, you're gonna be able to use your mouse class inside of one component and your mouse class in another component. And when those two components get rendered, it's not even gonna be called mouse anymore. It's gonna be like a random string of characters. So it's gonna ensure that you don't have collisions with your CSS across components. But when you're not using a framework, this is a good practice to use so that you can essentially create these small components and potentially have a small performance boost on your stuff. I don't know what any of this is called.